Good morning, everyone. Are there a couple of people in the other room who would like to join? Thank you. So welcome to everybody here and to the many folks who are joining us via live stream. My name is Tom Tock, and I am the Director of Future Ed at Georgetown University. We're an independent think tank working to strengthen the education sector for the nation's disadvantaged students. We're very, very pleased this morning to host Andreas Schleicher and a discussion of his new book, World Class: How to Build a 21st Century School System. As many of you know, Andreas is the Director for Education and Skills at the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, otherwise known as OECD, in Paris, where in 2000 he launched the Program for International Student Assessment, known to many as PISA, a triennial examination that compares the academic performance of more than 24 million 15-year-olds in more than 90 countries that generate 80% of the world's economic output. PISA tests 15-year-olds, by the way, because they have reached the endpoint of universal education in most countries. Andreas also leads the OECD Survey of Adult Skills and the OECD Teaching and Learning International Survey that takes the pulse of the teaching profession globally every few years. Andreas' new book draws together in a comprehensive reform blueprint the lessons he's learned from 2 decades on work on PISA and from his near perpetual travel over that time to schools in the world's advanced and advancing nations. There's arguably no one in the world who knows more about the global education landscape than Andreas does. So we're going to start this morning by having him share some insights from his work on school reform, and then we'll have a conversation about World Class and Andreas' presentation with a distinguished panel of U.S. educators. Andreas?
Thank you, Tom, for hosting this event. I think this is a fantastic opportunity for me to sort of present some of the ideas that I've developed at the OECD over the last 20 years. The world is an amazing laboratory where we can actually see, what works in what context, the kind of ideas, how they've played out over time, sometimes successful, sometimes less successful. So that's what I'm going to talk about. And first of all, we benchmark learning outcomes through an international test, as Thomas just explained, this PISA. And we did our last major test around science, and that's something that we started in 2006. And 2006 is a long time ago for most of us. One way to remember it was the year before the iPhone was invented. We didn't have smartphone in those days. Twitter was still a sound, the Amazon still a river. Many of the things we take for granted today did not exist in those times. Well, when you look, educational development in the United States, and in fact in most industrialized countries, is only marginally advanced. And the world didn't stop in 2009. You could see, maps becoming dynamic, cars becoming electric. Now they can drive without a driver. But, those things have not translated in students becoming better in science. And when I say better in science, I don't mean that they don't know more content knowledge, perhaps. But what we are trying to focus on in this assessment is, can you think like a scientist? Do you understand the kind of fundamental paradigms on which science is built? And we've really seen no change in this. And just imagine the last, 3 years. You think about big data, cloud computing, robotics, bioengineering, huge developments. And once again, we haven't seen that translating differences in learning outcomes. And, again, in the industrialized world, the picture is no different. Most countries' educational outcomes have remained pretty flat. There are exceptions, country in Europe, Portugal, it's quite amazing how they, despite, being a relatively poor country, have continued to progress. Or, countries like Singapore moving from good to great, and some regions in China you can no longer put on this map. So there are actually areas in the world with remarkable progress. But there are sort of a few systems around the world, and that's why I think we have reasons to sort of think how we can improve this. And the first thing that we all talk about is, putting more money into the system, and that helps you, at the beginning of the trajectory. If you're a country if you are a country sort of in development, money can make a huge difference in terms of learning outcomes. But for most countries in the industrial world, just investing more isn't related to better outcomes. Another thing that you might think about is time, and there are huge differences in the amount of hours that students spend learning across the world. In blue, I've marked here the time that students spend studying in school, and in yellow, things like, tutoring, homework, things that go on out of school. And you look, for example, there, the United Arab Emirates, students spend close to 60 hours learning per week. In Finland, it's only a little more than half the time. But when you actually look at productivity in the system, how much do students actually learn an hour? You can see in Finland, Germany, Switzerland, Japan, Estonia, students learn a lot in very little time. And in the United Arab Emirates, students spend a lot of time and learn very little. So again, it's not just about the volume of money. It's not just about the volume of time. It's a lot to do with how we use the time. And I think that's where international comparisons become really constructive. And if you look at the United States, actually learning time is not so bad, actually. Students in the US spend more time in school than the average OECD country. But also there you could see probably we could make better use of the student learning time in this context. When you ask yourself, why don't we see much change? I mean, most of the things are pretty obvious. Education is a very kind of conservative social environment. As parents, we get very nervous when our students learn things that we don't understand. And we may get even upset when they no longer learn things that we felt so terribly important for us. So teachers are often more likely to teach how they were taught than how they were taught to teach. And I think there are many reasons. And as a politician, you can easily lose an election over education when something goes wrong, but you rarely win one over an election for education, because it just takes so much time to develop good ideas and implement them and get results. There's a big asymmetry of the costs and benefits of education reform. We know that, improvement spreads over lots of people. Sometimes the costs are very concentrated. So it's not very difficult to find the reasons why things are so difficult in education. But the question of the book is a different one. The question of the book is, what can we learn about how to do things better? And when you actually compare the past, and I call it the kind of industrial education system, and the world-class systems, the first thing you see is that they have actually moved from just sorting people to really developing talent. They actually believe that every student can learn, and they invest whatever it takes to get everybody to succeed. And that's something that we can see in our data. Second point, they have also advanced from focusing on routine cognitive skills, having people reproduce subject matter content, to actually strengthen complex ways of thinking, complex ways of working, kind of quite advanced mix of cognitive, social, and emotional skills that are actually important in the 21st century. The trouble is that this actually has a lot to do with our work organization, the kind of teachers. In the past, it was all about standardization and compliance. What we actually see in a world-class system is how teaching has become a true profession that owns its professional practice. And that has, again, implications for how you work. Professional knowledge workers don't like to work in a Tayloristic work organization. They look for flat collegial work environments, and they look for, opportunities to connect with other people rather than working in systems with vertical accountability. So it's all connected. But let me sort of highlight a few points that I think are really important. The first is, how do you advance from sorting to real improvement? And the first thing that people often see is, you look at the reality, student learning outcomes by decile of social background. You can see if you are from a very poor social background in the United States, you do really, really poorly on the PISA test. If you come from a wealthy background, your results are much better. And people have accepted that as given. Many people say, poverty is destiny. There's very little you can do about it. But again, it's worth looking outside the country. If you would take these students with this kind of social background and put them in the education system of Singapore, you can see they come out pretty well as the average American student. If you take these students and put them in the system of Shanghai in China, you can see they compare with the kind of most privileged students in the United States in mathematics. And I think what those comparisons show is that poverty is not destiny, and you do have kind of working conditions in those kinds of schools where they attract the most talented teachers in the most kind of challenging classrooms, and they invest whatever it takes to help the most disadvantaged students succeed. And that is not, a trivial thing. If you actually look to a province like Shanghai, they get about, 500,000 people coming into the province every year. And those people are not wealthy people. They are the poor peasants from the neighboring kind of fields. So they have actually a massive challenge with social disadvantage, but they have shown us that we can actually do something about it. Now, what to do about it? This looks very encouraging. We studied how well do we do in aligning resources with needs. And what you can see is when you see that the class size in a kind of disadvantaged schools is often much smaller than it's in the privileged kind of environment. So in one way you can say we are allocating more teachers to more disadvantaged students. That looks like a great thing to do. You put more resources to where they are more needed. But when you look at teacher quality, you can see exactly the reverse. If you come from a disadvantaged background, you have the greatest shortage of qualified teachers. If you come from a wealthy background, shortage is much less pronounced. So on one hand, we can say, yeah, we put more resources into disadvantaged schools, but still, when it comes to the quality of resources, it's regressive. That's the average picture. And that's exactly where most high-performing systems are different. Particularly the East Asians, they create always incentives to get really the greatest people into the most difficult environment. If you're a vice principal in a high-performing school in Shanghai and you want to become principal, there is no way for you to get there without taking on one of the toughest schools and show that you can actually change it. Same is true in Singapore. Same is true in Finland. Basically, alignment of quality of resources with needs is something, and we don't see that often because we only look at numbers. On the numbers, things look great, but actually as soon as you try to measure quality alignment, big kind of differentiator. What can we do about this? There are many things that you can see, interesting examples across the world. You can see, for example, how countries have begun to see schools as systems. And that can happen even, in a country like the Netherlands or Flanders in Europe, or Hong Kong. I just came from Hong Kong. Basically, those are systems where basically every school is like a private school or a voucher school or a charter school. They're all connected. They're all part of a public kind of system. So that's a really important part, how you build kind of a strong systems. How do you actually align resources with needs? Now, most countries actually in the OECD have now what we call formula-based approaches to school financing, which means that you either give money to the schools or to the parents to ensure that, where there is greater need, you have also more money. There are sort of admission policies around this. There are efforts to pair schools. And that's also an interesting part that we see in parts of Brazil where they have lots of success, where they have systematically paired high and low performing schools. If you are a high performing school, you get more money, but you cannot, so you can hire more teachers, more expertise. You cannot use those resources in your own school. You can only devote those resources to the low-performing school with which you're partnered. So they're actually quite good ways to actually manage resources. And then, of course, parental engagement. So many interesting instruments that we can actually look at. The last part, and this is just sort of an aside, but obviously learning starts before school, and the investment that countries have in early learning has been quite phenomenal. Probably 10 years ago, most countries were like the United States, where you had, an average of 2.5 years of pre-primary education before school. But in most countries, that's now pretty universal. But, and that's sort of, I think, a really disturbing news, you can see really that if you come from a wealthy background, you've got more early childhood education than you get from a poor background. So in one way, while early childhood education is a golden opportunity to level the playing field, giving the disadvantaged children a greater start, actually most countries is the reverse. You come from a privileged background. You have more education early on, and you have also better education early on. So there's a lot I think we need to do about this. But I want to come to the more challenging parts, and this is how do we advance from teaching students to reproduce knowledge to actually create knowledge? Because one thing is clear, the kind of things that are easy to teach and easy to test are precisely the kind of things that are also easy to digitize, automate, and outsourced. And you can see that really well when you look at the United States and labor demand. There's been a decline in the demand for manual skills, but the steepest decline actually is in what we call routine cognitive skills. Remembering something and hoping that's going to help you later in life. That works less and less because you don't compete with computers on that. Big increases in the demand for non-routine analytic skills. That's about your capacity to extrapolate from what you know, to apply your knowledge creatively in a novel situation. That's sort of what's behind the idea of PISA. But interestingly, there is even a line which is rising even faster, and that's social skills. Your capacity to collaborate, compete, and connect. Again, how can we mobilize knowledge? We did that in 2015 PISA assessment for the first time. We tested collaborative problem-solving skills, and the results were very different from individual problem-solving skills. Some countries that were good on individual skills did not do so well on collaborative skills. So something I think we need to just keep in mind. What's also interesting, in a kind of technology-rich workplace, you're actually more likely to read, to write, to be numerate, or to work with numbers. So actually technology changes dramatically the skill demand. You're also, what's interesting, you're more likely to learn from coworkers. So again, that's a social skill dimension. Learn by doing and keeping up to date. So the digital environment actually is a great context for people to actually keep growing if we give them the right skills to start with. And that brings us back to the education. Golden and Katz have written this great book about the race between education and technology. Before the Industrial Revolution, neither technology nor education made a big difference for the majority of us. That was a very remote kind of challenge. Then came the Industrial Revolution, moving technology ahead of people. And while today, we marvel at the outcomes of the Industrial Revolution, you wouldn't have wanted to live in those times. People who lived in those times had a very, very hard time because they were not prepared. But that's when we invented the kind of industrial model of schooling, getting everybody compliant with the norms of the industrial society, and that created lots of prosperity. But if we are honest with ourselves, we haven't really seen much change since those days. We have got more people into this platform, but we haven't changed the model of education. And today comes the digital revolution, doing exactly the same thing, moving technology ahead of people, and we're seeing the same phenomenon that we have, more and more university graduates leaving schools, having difficulties finding a good job, and at the same time, millions of employers saying they cannot find the people with the skills they need. And it's the same kind of phenomenon. So the question really is, how do we move again ahead of the curve? And I think there are good reasons to assume that this is possible. And I think the answer really lies in, how do we pair the artificial intelligence of computers with the kind of human qualities that make us different. We've thought about this a lot in our work at the OECD and from going around countries. Knowledge obviously is always a big part of success, but it's no longer primarily about content knowledge, but the kind of epistemic and interdisciplinary functions of knowledge are becoming more important. Cognitive, social, emotional, practical skills are important, and the most controversial part is the thing around, attitudes and values. Today, learning is no longer about learning something or teaching something, about helping people to develop a kind of reliable compass, the navigation skills to find your own way in this world. So those are huge, huge challenges. There's lots of discussions around. We're starting to collect data on this. Give you an example of one of the high-performing systems in the world, Canada. You can see on the 21st century dimensions of critical thinking, communication, problem solving. They are doing really, really well, at least in the intended curriculum. And they embody this, they don't make this a special subject, but they are able to embody this in virtually every subject. But you can also see other areas, respect, self-regulation, resilience, empathy. Those things are almost empty, even in the intended curriculum. You take another high performer, Japan, Canada does so well on critical thinking. That's almost missing in the case of Japan. So high performer, but not on everything. They are good on communication, problem solving. They are good on student agency. But you look at entrepreneurship, in the 21st century, student agency is probably the key driver for your own success, non-existing. So there's a big gap, even in high-performing education systems, between what the world expects and what we see in the instructional systems. Third challenge, how do we move from systems that are industrial, where you basically just look up to the next level in the system, to connecting people, how to build the kind of social fabric in the education system that helps systems succeed. We've looked at this as well. That's where teacher professionalism come in, and I devote a lot of the book to that kind of question. What does it actually, what does professional autonomy mean, and what does a collaborative culture mean? Because those are the real ingredients. No? And we have really tried to start to measure those things. No? First of all, teacher professionalism obviously has to do with knowledge of teaching, knowledge of the curriculum, knowledge how you teach the curriculum, knowledge about how students learn, and so on. And those things are very, very important. But professional autonomy, again, what discretion the teachers have over the design of the instructional system, how they are part of the design of the instructional system. You can see huge differences across countries on this. No? The role that the teaching profession has in the design of the instructional system varies hugely across countries. No? In the old industrial system, you delegate that responsibility to someone in the government, and then the knowledge trickles down into schools, and teachers are meant to implement it. In a top-performing system, the people who work in the profession own the professional practice. And I think that's a big, big differentiator. And the last part is also important. That's the kind of collaborative culture that is in the system. The opportunities teachers have to work together to frame good practice. And there are huge differences in amount of time that teachers are getting to this. I can tell you, a teacher in Singapore would have more than twice the number of hours out of the classroom to work on issues around professionalization. One of the costs of lowering class size in the United States over many years has been that actually the non-teaching working time has been driven out of the school system. There are very few countries where the number of teaching hours that teachers have are higher than in the United States. That's the kind of cost of the system. All those three elements are really what in the analysis is what teacher professionalism is about. And let me just sort of briefly illustrate this. We have lots of data on this, but just take the last part, the teacher professional collaboration. This is the United States. You can say, you look at the picture overall and you see there is quite a bit of collaboration happening. Teacher discuss individual students, they share resources, they have team conferences, and so on. But when it comes to the more deeper level of collaboration, team teaching, collaborative professional development, doing things together and observing other people's teaching, that's actually very, very rare. And the reason this is important is it's actually the last part that really makes a difference when you look at things like self-efficacy of teachers or even job satisfaction. They're all around the collaborative culture that happens in a school. You can see that, and some countries, are doing quite well on this. Here you see the more teachers teach jointly as a team in the class, the more they observe other classes, the more they engage in joint activities, the more they take part in professional collaborative learning, the higher the degree of self-efficacy in the profession. So this is just not a nice to have. This is the core of professionalization. And that's exactly what we see in high-performing education systems. Now you devote time to many more things than teaching. Japan as well, China as well. You'd spend actually more time outside the classroom, working with students, working with parents than you spend in the kind of classroom setting. Finland, 30% of instruction time is delivered outside the classroom setting. You as a teacher are responsible for helping every student succeed, but you also have quite considerable resources to do that, and the price is often, and it comes, I just want to show you one contrast here to illustrate this. Here you have the student-staff ratio. Now that's basically how generous are you in teacher supply. No? And you can say in the United States, sort of a little bit less than the average, but pretty close to the average. And China, very similar to the United States in the number of teachers they have for every student. No? But when it comes to class size, this is where the systems are hugely different. No? The China with very large classes, and the United States with very small classes. And you ask yourself, why would countries with the same resources have such a different approach to the size of a class? No? And the answer is actually very simple. in the United States, the relatively small classes with a moderate teacher supply mean that teachers have no time for other things than teaching. In the Chinese system, they say, well, we give you a large class, but you have plenty of time for other things than the teaching profession. It's a totally different work organization behind this. But what you can see when you look at this across countries is that most high-performing systems are more on the right side, making basically a different trade-off between how they use the kind of teaching time. Interestingly, when we looked at teacher job satisfaction and class size, because you can say, well, maybe smaller classes are not so much more effective, but they're a driver of teacher job satisfaction. We didn't find that. And we asked teachers, how happy they are with their job, and then we related it to the size of the class, and we found it looks sort of pretty much the same. But when you look at teacher job satisfaction and professionalism, there you can see a huge difference. Where you have a high degree of professional autonomy, teacher knowledge, teacher collaboration, you have a high degree of satisfaction with the profession, satisfaction with the environment. You have a high degree of teacher self-efficacy. You have a high degree of the perception of the status of the teaching profession. Because one thing is important, it's easy to make teaching financially more attractive, no? And I think there's a lot the United States could do by paying its teachers properly, no? But actually, it's much harder to make teaching intellectually more attractive. And this is what it is about, and that's ultimately what drives job satisfaction. I think that's something really important to take to heart. How do we use the resources, and how do we balance the quantity and quality of people in the system? Last part, how do we move from a kind of heavily prescriptive environment to create true ownership of professional practice? And I want to show you sort of something that we found when we asked teachers about their ideas about teaching. In our Thales survey, you look at the United States, you can say 95% of teachers say, my role as a teacher is to facilitate students' own inquiry. Very constructivist view of education. You're saying that's the 21st century. You have 82% saying students learn best by finding solutions on their own. Looks again like the 21st century. You have 85% say thinking and reasoning is more important than curriculum content. Isn't that what I talked at the beginning, epistemic understanding as opposed to just, content reproduction? But, when you ask, to what extent do teachers say what they say, if actually American teachers would do what they say, you would find very little rote learning in the system. Because that's the opposite of a kind of constructivist approach to teaching. You would find the United States at the bottom of the list here. But actually, the bottom part is already given to Switzerland, then comes Poland, then comes Germany. Actually, the United States comes out very high when it comes to the prevalence of rote learning. So there is a big gap between what teachers say and what actually happens in the classroom. That's, by the way, also one of the big answers why the United States isn't coming so well out of the PISA test. Because students are very good at the surface, answering the kind of easy knowledge question, right? But as soon as the problem becomes complex, that's where they struggle. It's very much the picture that comes out also on this. If I had asked you at the beginning, China, the country of rote learning, but they are just they do some memorization, but it's not dominant. And the Chinese are also, at least in Shanghai, they're also very, very good in deeper learning, elaboration strategies, deep reasoning, where students have to connect what they don't know with what is unfamiliar. So I think this is very, very important that, there is a disconnect between what teachers aspire to, what they say is good professional practice, and what is actually happening in the classroom. And that disconnect is really important. Why? Look at this. When you actually think about memorization, it can help you for some tasks, but actually memorization can also hinder outcomes on many other tasks. When you have a complex reasoning task and you try to remember the solution, and there is no solution to be remembered, it can hinder you. And the more complex the problem gets, the basically less and less, or more and more does memorization hinders positive outcomes. That is the kind of dilemma in which we are. And why is this important? Because the world moves from left to right. This is where computers are far superior to humans. That's where we have a kind of comparative edge. And that's basically where I think a country like the United States really has a lot to learn from countries that are doing better in focusing on deep conceptual understanding, teaching fewer things at greater depth. And you can see also, elaboration strategies are not effective for simple tasks, but they are the big differentiator at the top end of the performance scale. Now, can students, think creatively, connect what they don't know with what they are familiar with, and things like that. The past was divided. We have students and content divided by subjects and destinations. The future needs to be a lot more integrated, helping students think across the boundaries of subject disciplines. Project-based learning environments are becoming more common. Cross-disciplinary learning is becoming more common. Finland is the first country that introduced an almost entirely cross-disciplinary curriculum. It's not yet clear to what extent that will be successful, but the idea of learning across the boundaries of subject disciplines is important. But again, it requires a different work model where teachers work very differently together. Standardization and conformity, replacing that with rewarding greater levels of ingenuity. And that's the last chart that I'm going to show you. We ask teachers, if you are more innovative in your teaching, is that something that leads to greater, public recognition or some other forms of recognition? And you can see it's only 23% of teachers who see themselves, working in an environment that is open and rewarding for innovation, whereas most teachers perceive that school is something that is rather innovation hostile. And if we can't change that perception, it's probably going to be very difficult to change anything. So that's all for the introduction, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andreas. I'd love to invite the panelists up. And that. Here, I'll take this. I'll collect random stuff.
Okay.
Everybody know where they're sitting?
I don't. Oh, we did that, perhaps totally by accident.
Well, that was hugely interesting, hugely stimulating, and not a little provocative, so thank you. So we're very fortunate to have with us 4 leading voices in American education to respond to your presentation and to share sort of a wider range of insights on these really important issues of where we go next in our education system. Chris Cerf, in the middle, is a former superintendent of the Newark Public Schools and a former New Jersey Commissioner of Education. He served as Deputy Chancellor of the New York City Public Schools and as Chief Operating Officer for the for-profit Edison Schools, back in the day where we first met. He was a lawyer in the Clinton White House, and he's a former high school history teacher early in his career. Lily Garcia is president of the National Education Association, the nation's largest teacher union and largest union in general. She's been the NEA's elected vice president and secretary-treasurer, and she started, not surprisingly, her career as a classroom teacher and was named Utah's Teacher of the Year in 1989. And she was also the first Hispanic to run for Congress in Utah's history, not an unimportant aspect of your background as well. Hannah Scandera spent 7 years as New Mexico's Secretary of Education, and she also was the Deputy Chief of Staff to the U.S. Secretary of Education, Margaret Spellings, in the George W. Bush administration. And she has also worked at the state level in other states as well, serving as Undersecretary of Education to Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger in California and as Deputy Commissioner of Education to Governor Jeb Bush in Florida. And to my immediate right is Claire Voorhees, who is the National Policy Director at Excel and Ed, which is, as many of you know, is a policy and advocacy organization founded by former Florida Governor Jeb Bush. And Claire has federal experience as well. She worked on education policy as an associate director at the White House Domestic Policy Council in the George W. Bush administration, and served also as an elementary school teacher in the South Bronx through Teach for America. So welcome to you all. Andreas, let me start with you. The subtitle of your book is How to Build a 21st Century School System. How do you define school system? You alluded to it a little bit here, but give us a little bit more insight into your notion of what a system is.
Yeah, I think the idea of a system is very important. High-performing systems are not a collection of individual schools, right? So they typically have policies and practice in place to share and jointly develop good practice. And take even an extreme, the Netherlands. It's a system of almost only voucher schools, no? But still, every school considers itself to be part of the public system. They have common kind of standards. They have shared policies for human resource development. So there is something that binds schools together. Take Finland. If you are a school leader in Finland, you spend 2/3 of your time in your school, and 1/3 of your time you spend in the municipality working with the government. So the municipality, the school district basically, is not a system of where we have just administrators, but actually school leaders are responsible for their schools, but they're also responsible for the system. So that's, I think, a very, very important notion. What mechanisms do we have for knowledge sharing and knowledge mobilization?
Okay. You note in your book that countries with high-performing education systems, quote, tend to align policies and practice across the entire system. In this country, the Bush and Obama administration championed that concept, promoting high common standards, tests aligned to such standards, performance-based teaching profession. So do you think that the recently enacted federal Every Student Succeeds Act in this country and its emphasis, or with its emphasis on local autonomy in education policy is a mistake, given your conception of a system?
Well, that's an interesting point. I would not see local autonomy and a shared notion of what good performance is to be in contradiction. In fact, it's again an attribute of high-performing systems. They have a very clear shared notion of common kind of ideas, standards, and so on, but they give their schools considerable discretion in terms of being innovative, developing solutions, and sharing those kinds of solutions. In fact, again, we might think of China as being top-down and so on. Actually, if you go there, you'll find exactly the opposite. If you have a great idea as a teacher, you can ask the ministry for a grant, and they give you a grant. They give you money for actually encouraging innovation. If you are successful at the end of the school year with your experiment, they will not say it's right or wrong, but they say, show me that you can actually replicate this in 10 other schools with other people in other places. If you're successful there, maybe one day you become an experimental school. So that's how bottom-up innovation, local autonomy actually contributes to a shared notion. But again, I think local autonomy without a strong shared notion of what good learning outcomes is about, I don't think it's going to get you very far.
Reactions? Hannah.
I'll say one of the things that struck me about your book was we so often in education want to say it's either or. And there's a lot of both and in your book. There's a lot of both and in regards to, I was thinking about the U.S. and your question around the new administration and ESSA and a more kind of authority at the state and local level. I think as I reflect on work in New Mexico and other states, you've got to have the foundational pieces. Standards, high standards, expectations, accountability. But that's just a starting point. It is a foundation that you have to then build the entire house. And I was struck, if I could extrapolate from your book, that in essence, yes, our high-performing countries have moved beyond the structure of accountability and high standards, et cetera, but they have them. They're just on to the next conversation, which is, after you know where you are, what are you going to do about it? Once you know that your kids are struggling or high-performing or somewhere in between, how are you beginning to build to actually individualize around students?
If I can just add one more point, in the United States, you often think that you have a lot of local autonomy because there's a lot of power as a districts. We have good metrics on this. If you actually look, the relative discretion that schools have and teachers have is actually very low, much lower than the OECD average.
So, echoing Hannah's point, the answer to any hard question in this realm is it depends. And the dichotomization of radical autonomy or devolution versus a top-down command and control system. As I read your wonderful book, by the way, I really encourage everybody to read it. There's no clear answer to that. Certainly the optimal, idealized system, and the one that I think, frankly, I, in my own personal professional evolution, have evolved towards, is much more of a inclusive, bottoms-up, maximize discretion at the very end of the supply chain, at the teacher level, at the classroom level, at the school level, than where I started, I will say, decades ago. However, as you also point out, that doesn't mean that there is latitude for what you term idiosyncratic practices, or that anything goes, or that 1,000 flowers blooms. In order to have autonomy work, right, first of all, you need to define success at the center. That is not up for grabs. Can a child read by the 3rd grade? You can't say every teacher in every classroom gets to decide whether or not that's a good idea. That's a central function. Second, it highly depends on the capacity of the teaching force, meaning that not everybody is an innovator, and not everybody will leverage innovation in a way that maximizes success for children. And the more you have a teaching force that is properly recruited, trained, developed, respected, compensated, the more likely you are to be able to devolve a great deal of power down to that, who will do much better than guys like Hannah and me, who are sitting in the top somewhere telling people allegedly what to do. So it really, really does depend on the conditions for success. But we have tried radical devolution in the community schools movement. I don't mean the current one. I'm talking back in the 60s and 70s. And that didn't work very well if the measure is student outcomes. So we want to get the best out of our teachers to give them the maximal opportunity to be creators and innovators and leaders, because frankly, they know more than the generals in the room. But it doesn't work in all conditions. So we have to create, last thing, the word I really took from your book, the enabling conditions are essential before you even get to the question of autonomy versus decentralization.
I started teaching in 1980 when I was 12. And who would have thought that the glory years would be the Reagan administration, you know? And what made this, your presentation, Andreas, connect for me is I really felt like I had the ability to be creative. We had no institutional collaboration time. Collaboration time for me at Orchard Elementary in Salt Lake City, Utah, was third lunch, where my colleagues and I would just sit around and we'd say, how's it going? And you've got Lonnie, and here's what worked with me, and here's how you can bring his parents in as partners. And we would sit around and we would solve problems. When No Child Left Untested hit us in 2002, it changed everything. When I almost got tears in my eyes looking at that slide you had about how much time we spend in rote memorization, because we can date it back to that 2002, where we were given, as educators, a quota of points on a test score that we had to reach. And what we knew we should be doing in terms of critical creative thinking, social emotional development, arts, sports, everything that needed to be built around that whole child. So for us, and Tom, to get to your point on Every Student Succeeds Act, for us, it is an opportunity to go back and talk about what is our responsibility to create some learning community around that whole child, and get away from this factory model that says, what's your quota of test points? And how do we really get a community schools movement in the way that we think of community schools today, where everyone has collaborative authority to build something around that child and build something around that entire community. We don't have a national system. We have a state-based system. The entire role of the federal government was designed from 1965 to support vulnerable populations of students who had been underserved. They shouldn't be underserved. We shouldn't accept that as a premise, that in certain states and certain communities, certain students, by race, by disability, by immigrant status, are underserved. Now what we have to do is actually take to heart this type of research that says it's time to move away from something that defines student achievement as did your test scores go up or down. That's a data point. I made out a lot of report cards. I looked at a lot of data points before I said B+. It was never one test. And that's what gives me hope about this research.
So Lily, do you agree with the concept, though, of both and, the need for both shared high standards, for example, and autonomy on the part of local educators in executing those standards?
Absolutely. And the question is, standards to what end? We've been drilled to death about a standard is a cut score on a standardized test. That is not a standard. A standard is, can your students make a logical argument and defend that argument with evidence? That's a standard. It's something, can you do this?
Exactly.
Is there evidence of that? And so that's what we actually want to talk about. What does success look like? And one of the things that we insist on is when we look at not just Andreas's current book, but all of the information that we've gotten over the years, the evidence is quite clear when you look at the highest performing countries, systems. They have incredibly, deeply prepared career professionals. They have resource equity. In Finland, every public school looks like their best public school. We cannot say that in this country. And you have incredible professional authority to collaborate and to make decisions on the, not just the school district level, the school building level. Mm-hmm. That's the formula.
We'll come back to some of those for sure.
So
Yeah,
I first of all, I really substantially agree with almost everything you just said. If I can offer one point of modest qualification. So I was an AP U.S. history teacher back in the day. That was one of the courses I taught at the high school level. And here's how it worked, right? And I'm going to the point of tests are inherently bad, that every kid is reduced to a number. Someone I never met wrote a bunch of questions, and at the end of the year, I knew that my students would be asked to look at 5 primary documents they'd never looked at before and write a persuasive essay that demonstrated that they had understood the documents and that they could put that into an understanding of some historical context, like the Progressive Era or the like. And that's what I taught, right? I taught people how to succeed at that test, right? And I think that was effective teaching. The AP, by the way, is wildly popular with teachers, students, and so on. So where I absolutely agree with you is that the legacy tests were terrible. They invited memorization. They invited, they certainly did in my state, New Jersey, the HESPA and the ASK. But it's not the existence of a test, because almost all of the high-performing districts that you mentioned in your OECD review actually have a central definition of success and a central mechanism for evaluating it. That is a common denominator. It's the quality of the tests, and also the extremely important point you make that there's much more to the definition of a child than a single data point, which I fundamentally agree with. But the absence, if you are going to have standards, the absence of knowing the degree to which those standards are met is only half of the story. So I think we're in agreement, but it is
we're in total agreement.
Yeah.
There's not anything I would disagree with. As I said, I had to make out a lot of report cards.
Yeah, right.
And I gave a lot of tests. My kids, if they were here right now, would be laughing at any suggestion that I didn't approve of tests.
Right.
But they had projects, they had essays, they had debates, they had a dozen different ways to show me that they got the information.
Right.
And that's what we're also missing.
Right.
When you say, one of the slides, Andreas said, will you be rewarded if you're creative or successful or something? What we've done is we've for many states and many teachers you'll be rewarded if you go up certain number of test score points. That corrupts everything. That corrupts the data that you actually could use to improve teaching and learning. But I was rewarded every time some kid said, I love being in your class. That's not a small reward for a teacher, to see that, that the kids got it, that they were excited to learn, that they were curious, that they asked questions. So the kinds of rewards that educators get are knowing that they did their jobs and they were able to do them well. They were able to do them in a way that had integrity. What is lowering our happiness level is saying, somebody tells me I have to be on page 73 today. Mm-hmm. And that's not teaching and learning. That's what's killing us.
So it sounds like we're agreeing here that standardized tests are in fact an expression of educational standards. Claire, what's your sense of the right balance between external expectations and local autonomy?
I mean, I think each level of government should do what it's best, what it's good, and what it's suited to. So sort of the logical approach, and that the federal government is in a good place to set a national vision, to require transparency for tax dollars for parents, and that to me, and the requirement of testing, it fits in appropriately there. Research, something spreading those good ideas, something that the government is set up to be good at. I'm not saying we do a great job of it right now. So those are the types of roles I want to see. History has proven, I think, at least in the United States, the way we're set up in our federal system, that the federal government is not good, nor should it be setting standards, nor should it be establishing curriculum or getting down into classrooms. And I think, but what Hannah said, there's an evolution here. I think No Child Left Behind, I think in 2002 was the right role for the federal government. We didn't even know where those kids were failing and being neglected. Yes, we could look at school buildings, but we didn't have the data to tell us. It's certainly not the right law for right now. And ESSA gets more at a balance, I think, when we talk about the guardrails of, sure could do a much better job. We are not there with testing. Testing is sort of, our version of testing right now is I think the best of what we have right now. It could certainly be a lot better and do a lot of the things, Lily, that you're talking about of being more on demand, being more innovative. But I kind of shudder at a world where we don't have that, and where our federal government isn't requiring that, while allowing states and localities to fill in all the gaps in between. I think we've proven we're good at that, and then hands off from there.
Andreas, are there other countries that do standardized testing well? Lily makes a good point, right? And she echoed the point that you made in your presentation. Testing can be shine a light on a system in very positive ways, but it also can drag down the level of instruction if we don't do it right. It can teach the wrong kinds of things. Who does it well?
Yeah, first of all, I think what's important is to keep, tests as a key to looking outwards. Otherwise, the school culture gets very much inward-looking. I think the question is really of what consequences flow from that. Most high-performing countries have the stakes of testing high for students and low for educators. In the United States, it's exactly the reverse. Sort of the stakes for students are almost none. It doesn't matter how you do on a state test, but the stakes for educators and schools are high. And that leads, I think, to the kind of distortions that you're talking about here. And I think if you look to, in Europe, testing would be actually more. People always say in the United States, students are over-tested. There's actually no evidence to support that. The prevalence of testing in many countries is actually higher, in Europe and certainly in Asia. But what you typically have is the focus is more on diagnostics. The focus is more on understanding the system, and less on that. It would be very rare that it has direct consequences for teachers and schools.
What about the quality of tests in other countries?
That's the point I want to come to.
Yeah.
I think the moment you make the stakes for educators high, you end up trading in validity gains for efficiency gains, and you trade in relevance for reliability, because at that moment you can no longer afford to make a mistake. You're going to be sued for making a mistake. So in the end, the tests become very shallow. They become the kind of multiple choice tests that are easy to administer, and they look very objective. Whereas good assessments really have complex formats. They require open-ended responses. They require kind of, and I think that's the kind of problem that comes with immediate consequences. I want to say the same thing about standards. Actually, I observed something really interesting. When we started with PISA, there was a time, when Common Core was, first discussions in the US, and at the same time, where the discussions in my own country, Germany, about building in a federal system a set of Common Core, a shared vision of good performance, which, again, is a characteristic of high-performing systems. But, whereas in the United States, Common Core immediately got tied to, let's measure outcomes, let's do something around this. In Germany, the idea was, okay, let's develop standards and think about, how they influence the curriculum, how can we educate teachers, and there was a kind of 10-year program in there. It looked very lengthy, whereas the United States approach looked very quick. But if you look 10 years later, actually, in Germany, those standards have traction now. They are really part of the instructional system. They are a shared vision of what good performance is. In the United States, it became, again, an instrument that was perceived to be external, not owned by the teaching profession. I think it's the same point as with testing. The shared standards, I think, are really important. The assessments are really important. It's the way we use them.
Can I give an example?
Yeah, hang one second. Hannah, yeah.
I was just struck by, to me, as I was reading your book, Honors, which I echo Chris, there are numerous nuggets of just like, that's, and you're just pulling from different spaces going, that's amazing, and the data is incredible to kind of back that up. I am struck by, and I'm going to do something, Tom, that I'm hoping we can pivot. God knows, I think standards and assessments matter, as I said, as a foundational piece, and that they're high and that they are part of a system. You spent a fair amount of time in your book talking about, and you actually early on said something to the effect of, we often talk public versus private instead of public with private. And I would love to have a little bit of a conversation around, in the US in particular, it seems to me we've done a lot of versus, public versus private. And you explore internationally this theme of a lot more private space in education than we see here today, and the blurring of those lines, if you will. And I think it was a fascinating section in the book, if you will, and provocative for our conversation and the conversations we have today, particularly as we think about choice and the conversations we're having across our country about choice now. And you introduced also vouchers. And so I would love for you to give a quick, because I think that would, I'm sure we have varying opinions.
I do actually have a question on that, so thank you.
Excellent.
You go now.
As I said, I came yesterday from Hong Kong. Hong Kong actually didn't have any history of public schooling. Hong Kong, basically, schools were invented or developed by philanthropy, and sort of it grew sort of the system. And today, all schools are parts of, private networks, but still, they would consider themselves part of a public system. If you are a parent, you have, amazing diversity of approaches, of pedagogies, of, philosophies in schools you can choose with. But you can rely on every school being a good school and every school being part of a system. You can move your child. Sort of school choice is not, either this or that. And but it's one system. And I think one thing I've learned is the more local autonomy you have, school autonomy, or even up to the point of vouchers, the stronger your system actually needs to be. And that's often sort of what we get wrong. What is toxic is vouchers and deregulation.
Right.
What is actually can work really well is vouchers and a really robust regulatory framework that assures quality, because when you put the responsibility on parents to make good choices, it rarely works. That's very clear evidence across the world that parents don't have the information, particularly those parents from disadvantaged backgrounds, to make. So you as a government has to make sure that what parents can choose between good options, but not between good and better and worse options. That's what we see. For example, again, in Europe, the Netherlands, Flanders, voucher-based systems, very little variation in the quality of schooling, much less so than you would find in a public system in the United States. In Finland, you could make the argument every public school is like an American charter school in this extent to which it can, decide on its organization, what kind of staffing, and so on. So I think the question really is what regulatory systems do we put in place to assure quality and make sure that the kind of competition is not on the demand side, but on the supply side.
And
So,
can I just,
have to jump.
yes, I'll give you one.
charters all across the country.
Yes.
Me
Let me,
holding back.
let me ask one question first. So on the regulatory side of this, what about access? So are the schools picking the kids, or are the students picking the schools?
That's a very good question. Actually, that's where, for example, a country like Sweden went very badly. At the beginning, they said, you make waiting lists in schools. And then now they end up with a model of controlled school choice, where basically, you try to sort of equalize access. And we also find that when you have vouchers, targeted vouchers are always better than kind of universal vouchers.
Right.
So you have to have mechanisms in place to.
So I'm going to let Lily in here, but first I have to
Big
say
supporter
that
of
our
charters,
current
I'm sure,
Secretary of
based on-
Education supports a much deregulated, a radically, if you will, deregulated choice system, not the one you're proposing. Yes.
And you know all about that system. And I need air quotes around system. But I look at under some beautiful words like choice and having a marketplace of choices for especially underprivileged children, poor children. What we've done here is turn a private and a growing for-profit, as Betsy DeVos refers to it, industry. She says it's an education industry, and that's where we're heading. To me, that is the antithesis of what Finland, Canada, Singapore would ever accept. Some of the highest performing systems understand that community responsibility, and it would never accept the inequalities that we have in our public system, let alone exacerbating that by turning some schools over to private for-profit entities and having children without the means of having a quality public education and high-quality career teachers well prepared. And for me, it's been an excuse to say when we see the inequality in our own system, and it's shameful and it has roots in racism, where children in high minority areas, high poverty, high immigrant areas, black and brown children have schools and programs and services that are not equal to those in more affluent white neighborhoods because of the way we fund our schools. And so we have this broken system from the very foundation that advantages certain students and disadvantages other students. And instead of saying, should we not give all students the choice that the most affluent parents have? The most 80% of our most affluent parents send their children to their neighborhood public school. Why? Because it's a beautiful public school. It has AP classes and sports and a theater department. And it has a school nurse. And it has a librarian. That's like finding a unicorn in certain schools. Why are we not focusing on resource equity? Instead, we're saying, let's focus on getting a standardized test up, or a new curriculum where it's a scripted reading program that kills creativity. Why are we not focused on making sure all students have a great, high-performing public school with programs and services that other parents demand and get in their neighborhood?
Claire.
So that's my reason for getting up in the morning.
Mine too. I'm as outraged as anyone that certain students, particularly of certain colors, have to go to schools like the one that I taught in the Bronx. No parent should have to drop their children out there. And so I think, but I'm much more in Hannah's camp of the both and. I want that to be a great choice, and I also want. I think there's one thing that we that really spoke to me in Andreas' book, but then I want to come back to another point, is that is that there's something intuitive about empowering parents to choose the school that's right for their child. And not every public school can be that right child. And there's something precious about providing a lot of different, whether it's religious, whether it's pedagogical or artistic or whatever it is, that right match for that child, empowering parents to make that choice. That to me has nothing to do with whether or not we also want to raise up every single public school in the nation. What I get at, what we've seen looking across states, and my organization works in choice programs of various kinds across various states, is that this regulatory issue is really, it's a really careful balance in the U.S. in that I absolutely think there's a big regulatory role for providing parents with great information, for ensuring civil rights, for ensuring safety and that basic level of quality and safety for students. What I worry about is overreaching, and then you lose what is special about those private schools. You've seen there's been mixed results in some places like Louisiana programs where the regulations are so high, or in states where they have to take the state test that when kids participate in a private school choice program, when they aren't allowed to maintain their admission standards, that the best schools don't want to participate. There's a thing in the U.S. we place value as well on the private school and kind of the sanctity of the private school. So I think our balance has to be really different, or you're going to drive out those high-performing players and options for parents.
So I worry a little bit about the juxtaposition of we should do everything we can to equalize quality at every school, which is a value that I've never met anybody who would disagree with, right? As against the potential power of, and I'm not for profit, by the way, but of giving parents a range of choices. For me, that dichotomization doesn't reflect my own personal experience. In New Jersey, there are 586 districts, and when I was commissioner there, by the way, that's inherently absurd, but there are 586 districts in New Jersey. And we have equalized funding. In fact, schools that serve children in poverty get actually more money, dramatically more money than we've, and yet, birth circumstances largely determine educational outcomes in New Jersey, as they do in most affluent states. So it's not an allocation of resource issue. How did that happen? It happened because parents choose, under our system of government, to move to the districts that they can afford, which for better or worse, and I would say for worse, tend to have higher quality schools, partly because of the kind of students that aggregate there. So we have a radical system of choice that we don't even talk about today, based on the opportunity for affluent people, by the way, turbocharged in the 40s, 50s, and 60s by racist lending policies, by grotesque practices that essentially consigned children of color to live in districts where they just didn't have the opportunity to move to. So what I certainly want to endorse the idea that we should equalize resources. I also, by the way, I may disagree with some of my colleagues that if there are choice options, it is incredibly important to police equitable access so that it is not a selective thing, by the way, which we tolerate in the Stuyvesants and the Bronx Sciences and the magnet schools and the others without anybody ever worrying about that. But so it's very important to be able to police access. But I also think that giving parents some significant say that their economic circumstances did not afford them in what they think is best for their child, actually is a value that has driven improvements for system-wide in many places.
So I have a question.
Yes.
I have a question. What does the research say about the highest performing countries and the amount of, this is a lot of airtime we're spending on something called choice.
Yeah, we're moving
And I
off
don't
quickly
remember
in a minute.
I don't remember anything about Singapore, Finland, Canada, and other high-performing countries. Do they invest in this, or do they invest in something else?
Well, first of all, they reconcile the choice element with the equity element by having formula-based approaches to funding. Basically, if you have a more disadvantaged clientele, you get more money as a school, whether you are public or private or charter or not. And but when it comes to school choice, as I say, in many of those countries, you have basically a lot of diversity in the school systems. That is true. In Finland, it's true at the individual school level.
But in Finland, it's not a parent saying, I picked this school over here. They go to their neighborhood schools.
Well, you have parents who say, I prefer a Waldorf school or a kind of, those schools exist. But I don't think what's interesting, in Finland, only 5% of the performance variation lies between schools. So actually you choose between different versions of good schools. You are not, have to make a really difficult choice between a good school and a bad school. I think that's the point. And Singapore, the same thing. Singapore, I would say there's more uniformity in the system. You find less variability than you find in Finland. The Netherlands and Europe, high-performing system, far more diverse. But also there, the government ensures that every teacher that you encounter is qualified, certified. Every kind of, the kind of framework that is there allows schools to focus, to articulate on why they want to be special. It could
And we've had programs with magnet programs. We've had amazing diversity of programs within a school system, a public school system, under public accountability. We are still, as you can see, having a huge debate about shouldn't we say, yes, equity is good and fine if we ever get there, nice, but let's talk about charter schools and vouchers. And we spend an inordinate amount of time talking about Betsy DeVos's world, which I don't see reflected in any of the high-performing world-class schools that you talk about.
Any reaction to that, Andreas?
No, as I say, and Tom, you phrased it very well too. I think the more focus you have on differentiation in the system, the stronger your overall system really needs to be. That's, I think, the lesson that I draw from all of this, and that's what we do see. That systems that provide a lot of school autonomy in whatever form actually do have a very robust overall framework.
Right. So we have given a lot of airtime to this issue, and I appreciate you raising it, Hannah.
Sorry.
Happy to move on.
But let's move on, and perhaps we can come back to pieces of this. I do want to talk about the teaching profession, right? You point out, Andreas, that in high-performing systems, teachers feel ownership of the instructional program. They work as colleagues in collegial environments. They grow professionally and have the opportunity to do that. But then you also, which is, I think, very an important sort of framing, but then you also have a section in the book where you talk about making teacher unions putting teacher unions at the center of that effort. Could you just talk about that a little bit? And then, Lily, I'd love to get your reactions.
Yeah, first of all, what we do see in high-performing systems, there is usually a fair amount of career differentiation. And, in Singapore, the first day you enter a school, your school principal will ask you, what do you want to do with your life? You want to go into curriculum development, into instruction, into assessment policies. You will typically spend 100 hours every year on, pursuing that kind of path. There's a lot of diversity in careers. When it comes to, collaborative practice, this is not just, sitting around a lunch table. It's a highly structured process. You do classroom observation. They may videotape them, analyze them together. So that is how professional practice is shared and created in the profession. You are expected in Shanghai, very similar. You have a common platform where teachers share their kind of lesson plans and projects. And you're actually validated by your peers. The more other teachers download your lessons, improve your lessons, criticize your lessons, the more reputation you have in the profession. And your school principal at the end of the school year will not just ask you how well did you teach your students in the class, but what contribution did you make to the education system. So that's the expectation on people, not just to implement, but also to develop instructional practice. The research element. Finland, every teacher has to write a research master thesis, and not because they want them to be researchers, but they want to have this inquiry-based mindset. And that brings me to the unions. Often what we do see is where the relationship between unions and government is antagonistic. it's often a reflection of the work organization. The more industrial the work organization in schools, the more standardization, compliance, those things come into play, the more you get a union that plays on those things. The more professional you're a teacher, the higher the degree of professionalism in the teaching profession, the more the unions will take on a role of professional partners. And we do see actually a big difference in this. Every year we convene a summit of the teaching profession,
right,
where we bring together ministers and union leaders. And it's amazing to observe how in some countries this is a partnership where the unions actually represents the profession. And in others, it's an industrial relationship. I fight for the salaries and things like this. So that's, I think, where I think the difference.
So Lily, what's your reaction to this conception of a sort of next generation teacher, if you will, and how do you sort of reconcile the important enabling dimension of Andreas's vision, which is larger classes so that teachers have more time to engage in these professional collegial activities, and the union's traditional commitment to smaller class sizes?
So I had 39 sixth graders, so we're going to fight about that one, okay? Because you would not want your 12-year-old in a class with 40 or 45 kids. That's
Right.
my bottom line, because I really tried to reach every single student and have a personal relationship with them. And I was very, I needed time with those kids, and that's very difficult to do. But I absolutely adore the concept of the union as the hub of professionalism. It is, I think, the transformation. It's not the next generation, it's this generation. It's why I wanted to be a part of my union in Utah. It was the year I had those 39 kids. And I said, who's going to help with this? And it was my union that said, we've got a class size reduction bill, and we've got to help find ways to pay for it. And it was, put me in, coach. I want to do this. We have gone, I think we've been seeing a transformation within, at least within my union. That, and I know that the American Federation of Teachers, the AFT, I know that they're working along on parallel levels to say, how can we contribute? We were the founding members of the National Board for Professional Teaching Standards for National Board Certification, which just had its 25th anniversary. We were at the inception of that, so this isn't new for us. I think what's new for us is hearing that desperate voice, that Red for Ed wave of folks who, yes, were underpaid, but more than underpaid, they said, we want our professional voice heard. We want to make decisions for the students that we know by name. And we want politicians, well-meaning or not well-meaning, to trust us. How do we build something in that is institutionalized in terms of collaborative decision-making? How do we have labor management partnerships with the administration? How do we build those community schools that bring in? That's the public-private partnership that sets my hair on fire. Is I went to a community school ribbon cutting. It was sponsored by the Chamber of Commerce in Las Cruces, New Mexico. It was an amazing event that said the teachers, the administrators in this learning community have some ideas about these students who are immigrant students who who sometimes live in fear and hunger. And here's what we're going to do, and we need the community support to do it. But it was the teachers that came to me, their union, and said, we need some funding to get some planning together. Can we write a grant for this? They brought the school board in, and NEA was able to fund getting something like this off the ground. So the union, more and more, I think, is taking to heart that this is part of our job as much as pay and benefits, is how do we give that educator a respected voice in making decisions on that local school board.
Hannah, you as Secretary of Education in New Mexico developed what would, I think, generally seen as a well-regarded teacher evaluation system. Do you see teacher evaluation providing a foundation on which a more professional working environment can be built, or do you see it strictly in terms of accountability?
So off the top, I don't see it strictly as accountability. It is clear we've got a lot of lessons learned around teacher evaluation across the country, full stop. My fear is that as a result of lots of lessons learned, we don't keep building towards the professionalism. And I was struck, couldn't agree with you more, Lily, that I bet if we talked to every person in this room, we would say we want to contribute and create a professionalization in the teaching profession that in some spaces and places we see across our country, but certainly not enough. So I think the larger space is how do we get there? And actually I had a conversation around this with Andreas before this panel around what does it mean to bring some of that professionalism to bear. If teacher evaluation is strictly accountable, we've missed the boat. If teacher evaluation is the opportunity to differentiate, not in a punitive regard at all, but frankly, just to know where are we. So this goes back to the foundation piece, but that's just the starting point. It's not the end point. Now what? Now how do we create professional communities? Now how do we support struggling teachers and give them professional development they need? How do we reward, and in fact in New Mexico this week, our excellent exemplary teachers receiving $10,000 more for their excellence, and they're proud and excited and championing these things. How do we create an opportunity for engagement? And I've shared this as the Secretary for Education.
So
I got one confession, then you're all in. I didn't do a great job early on in engaging our educators in New Mexico in meaningful professional opportunities. I will say, and I'm not proud of that, there are a lot of pain points because of it. In the last 4 years, New Mexico has become well known for its teacher initiatives that are all about professional engagement, opportunity, and growth. And I am proud of that. It took too long to get there, but in your book, Andreas, I was struck by that. How do we create the both and? You did a lot of debunking of myths of it's not about how much money, it's about how we use it. It's not about the class size, it's about the quality. And I think in the professionalism conversation, we've got to be able and willing to have those conversations. What does it take to create professionalism?
So I'm in a phase of my career when I'm most interested now in how we move forward, as opposed to the mistakes that we have collectively made in the past. And I will tell you, maybe echoing some comments from both my left and my right, and not in the political sense, that we have dug ourselves a pretty deep hole in this country. And by the way, there's blame on all sides: the reform movement, the unions, and the next phase of this is absolutely organized around the value that you write about and Lily endorsed. When you go into a great school in this country, you feel the culture of connection and professionalism. The leader is someone who is bringing out the best in people. People have a shared value of achievement. And you walk into a lot of schools and you don't feel that at all, right? So it is a myth to say that that is a universal. But that is the goal to strive for. And as a former teacher, these many years ago, I will tell you that it starts with the teacher. Without a shadow of a doubt, you will never have a great school without great empowered teachers. I think that is an absolute given. You ask about the role of unions, and I want to be very appropriate about this because I am not a warmonger. I am very much about let's look forward. When I say we both dug holes in this, there's no question that Lily's organization and her counterpart in the AFD have invested huge amount of money in professionalism, in development, participating in the evolution of curriculum, and committed to the notion of giving every kid a great and quality education. They have also represented this sort of employee as employee side of the work, which is not inappropriate. That's what unions do. And the bridge between those two has sometimes very much been lost in the political debate, right? Defending, challenging about, what does tenure mean? Or we talk about autonomy, right? Well, does a school community have the right to choose who will work within it? right? Or does it not have the, as you do in the academies in England and elsewhere? The idea of a public school that's not connected to the district, but it's called a charter school. And all of these things, right? We have created this incredibly polarized debate, right? And it is the decibel level associated with that polarization which has masked the potential of unions to be partners in advancing towards professionalism. And I think all of us need to say, from this day forward, we're going to try to find a way to look past that and bridge that connection in a better and different way.
Amen. Amen. So we're just about at time, but we started almost 10 minutes late. I desperately want to give those of you in the audience here an opportunity to ask a couple of questions, and then I want to give each of our panelists a chance to suggest what he or she thinks is the most important next step U.S. education system can take to move school improvement forward. So, Barbara.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone, for a great dialogue. And Andreas, I can't wait to read your book. I guess I've spent a lot of my career at the World Bank looking across different education systems. And one thing that has not come up in the discussion today is the fact that this idea of autonomous professionals in the classroom with a high degree of peer interaction, productive peer interaction, and unions that are not very antagonistic with government, much of that seems to be correlated with education systems where teachers come from the top half of the academic distribution, meaning that the kinds of people that are to go into teaching are people that are attracted to a high prestige profession, high profession with high degree of professionalism, and that's not the case in the U.S. I mean, it's not the top of the academic distribution that wants to go into teaching. And it's not just, if you look at the data, it's not just a question of salaries not being high enough, because in some countries they're not that high, but it's the combination of the salaries, the professional incentives, the work environment, the prestige, and how do we change that in the U.S.?
So, two-part question. So, how did we get there, Andreas, in the U.S. To that situation, and sort of what's the way to work ourselves out of it?
Is it true?
Yeah.
But is that true?
Yeah, first sort of on the premise, actually, we have from our survey of adult skills some test scores for teachers and the average workers and highly educated work. Actually, the differences across countries are not as big as you might think. They exist.
Good question. Sorry, that's always the first question. Is the
so that the teacher test scores do not vary that much from those of other kind of college graduates. But I think the issue of how attractive the teaching profession is and whom you get, I think we have to ask ourselves, what is cause and effect? I really believe that if it's part of it is certainly financial conditions, and I think in the U.S. I think the particularly initial salaries are not very high. But I do think the bigger part really is how intellectually attractive a profession is. And that comes back to work organization. What career opportunities do you have? What kind of, development opportunities? How do you work with your colleagues? As I showed in the book, the kind of things that drive the attractiveness of the teaching profession have mainly to do with professional work organization. Professional knowledge, professional autonomy, collaborative culture, those things are the big factors. And I think that's, again, I believe if you want to actually get better teachers, it's not about, waiting for a spaceship that is going to bring you new people one day, but actually changing the work organization. And that actually gets the right people into the
And something very, very practical. One of the things that we know is when I went to the university, I had a student loan. When I finished 4 years, I think I owed $6,000. I paid $50 a month for 10 years, and I paid back my student loan. That is no longer the case. So you have parents discouraging their students, their own children who would love to go into education. You'll never pay off your student loan with what you're going to be making as a beginning teacher in West Virginia. Just don't do it. So one of the things that we would love to see on the state level is for the most talented university students to say, and in my junior and senior year where I would decide to go into a college of education tuition free, that is that important. I'll stay and I'll teach for a certain number of years, like ROTC in the military. It's that important that we invest in our most academic talented people to become teachers.
But real quickly,
Yeah,
I know
really
you're
quick.
told us.
I absolutely love that idea. It's a great disruption and gets at that culture issue of value in teachers in the way that we need it, because it's a real cultural shift. I think another way you get at the cultural shift is through small little disruptions. We're looking at what Arizona's doing around teacher certification, where Arizona realized that its top teachers coming out of ASU didn't interview around. They had relationships with schools that were going directly to the wealthy schools. Of course, that makes a lot of sense. So Arizona passed a law, I believe it was last year, where now individual charter and district schools will be able to certify, if they're high performing, will be able to certify their own teachers, recruit, look for that special, I mean, that to me gets that professionalization. The way that Teach for America say, like, that kid has something. That's the kind of culture we want in that school, and we're going to train you. We know how to do it for our school. That gets at autonomy and professionalization, and it's a cool disruption that we'd like to see move around.
Yes, I'm sorry about the.
Oh, I'm Emily, a former high school teacher. And Andreas, I was just curious what you thought in terms of curriculum as well as like student achievement success with the International Baccalaureate program, like what your research says about that program and how effective it is.
This is very hard to say. I think it's one of the internationally most successful programs. I think it's also sort of, when you think about 21st century learning, it's one of the examples of a program that has done that for a long time in a quite successful way. But the numbers are far too small to have really quantitative data on that.
Lawrence,
I think
last
there's,
one, I'm sorry.
Some cultural differences between the U.S. and everywhere else. We believe culturally in sort of social development, and sports is a huge factor. Some schools are spending 50% of their activities on sports. And we also believe in this world of second chances. So the low stakes test is not incidental. It's very fundamental to the whole system. And in the other systems, particularly some European systems, you have a very elitist kind of educational system with very high stakes tests with dire consequences for kids who don't get at the top levels. So we've made a series of cultural choices which we're sort of unconscious of almost, because they're part of the culture. And I just think that it's just worth thinking about. I don't know if you have any comments on this.
I do. I think this is a very valid observation. I think the way how systems design their gateways has a lot to do with the kind of cultural choices that you make. Still, if I look at the results, actually, some of those systems in Europe, for example, with very high stakes for students, are the most equitable ones. And I would say the same about Asia. The impact of social background, as I showed you in the initial slide, the impact of social background in Asia is a lot less than in the United States, because actually those high stakes gateways where actually every student counts, every student is expected to succeed, lead teachers to invest very differently. A kind of load, if the high school degree goes to everyone, then as a teacher, you don't have to really care as much as in those systems. So I care more about the outcomes, which system actually creates the highest and most equitable learning outcomes. And there I think the answer is very clear. It's those that have consistent high expectations and also stakes for students, though not so for the schools and teachers.
It's a really interesting point, because in this country, almost half of the students who go to higher education go to community colleges, which have open enrollment policies, right? All you have to do is have a diploma, so entrance standards are almost non-existent. What signal does that send to our high school system is the question. So let's go around, starting with Claire, and answer the question, what should be the next big thing in school improvement?
Well, the next big thing, hopefully this isn't punting on it, but the next big thing I think is looking at systems. And I'm really interested in what a group like City Fund is doing, what we're looking, and what our organization does, is that we can't just look at one thing in isolation. That just doesn't work in education. I think it's reflected in our conversation here. So looking at the microcosm of how do we set a city on fire, the way DC, the way New Orleans have, the way Chicago has. I'd like to see more charters, greater accountability for those charters and the whole system, a system that helps parents choose among them, and some more resources there, and see what we can really do on a city, and then how that we can translate that and do what we do so poorly in the U.S. is learn from the good things happening in one place and move them next door. that I'm excited about.
I couldn't agree more that I don't think there's a single thing. I think there's an iterative process. I think we need to build on the foundation we talked about, not throw the baby out with bathwater, even though we've learned a lot. I think we need to look at how do we blur some of the lines we've had between high school, college, and the workforce in a new and innovative way. We think about voc ed and we all cringe and think about tracking and we just stop in our tracks, no pun intended. It's time to really reimagine how do we blur those lines for our students and on into our economic engines across the country. And I couldn't agree more that I also think there's a much more, and you talked about this, Andres, in your book, more tailored for our educators and our students around kind of taking things to the next level and personalizing our learning as we move forward.
So I think any hard problem, and there's none harder than this, right, requires two things. One, you need to acknowledge it's going to take at least a decade and have a continuous approach to solving for it. And second, you need to define what the end state looks like and then backwards map off of that and do little things and little steps that converge around the outcome you're trying to do. I'm very persuaded by this conversation and a lot of things you said in your book that the thing we ought to backward map from is a system where there is this sort of professional accountability as opposed to administrative accountability, where there is a depth of engagement at the teacher and the school and the school level. However, I'm also persuaded that you can't just simply snap your fingers and say that, because it assumes capacity. It assumes will, and it assumes, frankly, a political environment in which that can happen. And so you have to view each of those as a component. I would start with a much more, you're going to find this deeply ironic, centralized approach to teacher education. I think that what Great Britain did, and I think it was in the Barber years, but what Great Britain did is a really deep lesson. We have this thing called academic freedom. We have a huge industry of preparation of teachers and others. There's incredible diversity of approaches. But I think settling on an approach that is much more effective than the one we have and creating a core of teachers coming into our schools who are equipped to be successful in a digital age, who buy into a system of standards and professionalism and so on. I think if we don't get that done right, we're going to be having the same conversation in 10 years. And that means, by the way, culturally, to your point, that this starts with our society respecting and valuing teachers reflected in money, but much more deeply than that, in how you break a tie between an angry parent and a teacher, for example. And there are lots of different ways to do that. And I think all of those things, from induction to training to professional environment, from inclusion in things like developing assessments, we made a big mistake. We did, by the way, include teachers in the development of the part in a huge way, but much less so in educator evaluation systems, as Hannah, I agree with Hannah on that. So anyway, that's a more complicated answer. You were looking for a little nugget, but that's my answer. Rich vein.
So I could not disagree more, ironically. And the cities that you mentioned, Claire, are a disaster because of unaccountable charter schools. And we now are seeing parents organize saying, you neglected my public school for this. I think it's time to close the door on those field reform practices. And what we want to do is look at the research of the most incredible high-performing school systems. They did not privatize. They basically closed their arms around the whole child, the whole family, the whole community. And they humanized education. They didn't standardize it. They made it something that was relevant. And what I want to see is that triangle of, I absolutely agree, that you have to have a way to prepare the most highly competent professionals, career professionals. We have to end that revolving door of, I'm sorry, Teach for America and other alternative folks that aren't prepared to go into that. Good-hearted people who need more than good hearts. I want to see prepared career professionals. And maybe that means things like making sure that they get a scholarship for going into the most important work in the world. But you put those highly prepared professionals in a school that has the resources and the services and the staff that they need. Back map to West Windsor High School. Go past the McMansions. Take a look at what our most successful schools have. They have AP classes. They have a school nurse. Every public school should look like that. Resource equity. And the killer app, highly prepared career professionals, given the resources and the staff, support staff they need, and give them the collaborative professional authority to make decisions for that school community.
Yeah, if I look sort of at the last sort of decades, the one thing, certainly No Child Left Behind has done is to shine a light on your low performance. And I think that's been really, really important to make sure that this is actually taken seriously. If you think about Common Core, it has, I think, put the concepts of rigor, focus, coherence in learning, sort of what is good learning really going to look like. So the next step, in my view, really is teacher professionalism and leadership capacity. Both really go together. And like Chris, I think initial teacher professional development is a very important element of this. In the book, I've outlined in quite detail of, we know a lot about how good initial professional development really works. It's fewer institutions, higher grade and much greater selectivity at the point of entry. But that only changes, 2% of your teacher workforce every year. Mm-hmm. And in my view, the really much more important challenge is the kind of learning opportunities for people in the system, currently in the system. It's about career structures. It's about, creating a greater sense of openness in the system. It's better support, more time out of the classroom for professional development. I think that's really the heart of, upgrading the existing teaching force. And, as time goes by, change will be ever faster so that you can less and less rely on initial teacher training and you need to more and more rely on what happens for people in the profession. I really think that is the heart of the next step, really, to create the conditions. And Chris, you make an important point. You cannot, professional autonomy always relates to capacity that's in the system. But again, you need to think about, where do you start? If you basically say, well, I can't trust the teachers to do that because they don't have the capacity, have a very constraining work organization, you'll never build that capacity. So it's about, taking the right level of risk and openness in the system to encourage people to, move up, take greater responsibility, recognize and reward, those people who make a fantastic contribution to the system with leadership responsibilities, teacher leadership, system leadership. There's so many opportunities that education can provide for people. And that is a much harder thing than Common Core. Building national standards or, Common Core standards is a necessary, relatively easy step. The second one, building the kind of capacity is the hard thing. And that, as you say, it takes decades. Japan, for every cycle, they build 10-year cycles into their system, and that is a fast-moving system, a system with very high capacity. They build 10 years into that kind of, and I think that's really, it takes patience to do that.
Well, I think we've been very lucky to have 5 very thoughtful leaders in our system and an expert on the world educational landscape to share both their reflections on where we've come and their insights into where we should go. So thank you. And join me in thanking them. Really good.
Thank you.
Really good.
Thank you.